So, Queensway, have you ever been on some sort of, after some sort of goal? You have a goal in mind, some sort of destination, some sort of objective you have in life, and found yourself veering off the track. Much like this toy train on the screen right now. I think this is a very common experience for us, right? Like we often set ourselves a goal. It might be an educational goal, might be some sort of personal development goal, might be some goal to do some sort of action, and we find ourselves getting kind of lost along the way. So what does it take for us? And maybe in one of these experiences where you had, what did it take for you to get yourself back on track? Now, I suppose there's a lot of different ways that we get ourselves back on track, but one of the primary ways is to kind of take a moment and pause and remember. What is the reason why I am going after this goal in the first place? What is at stake for me? Do I still want this goal, or is my veering off the path an indication that I actually want a different goal? Is that goal still valid in my life? And even while we reflect, we might feel a little bit of remorse and regret for the lost time, but I think we need to give ourselves a little bit of space and say this is kind of a natural thing, especially in this day and age, but even before the pandemic. Our lives are just so full of different things, and we often find ourselves in one wilderness or another, and there's just distractions and things, and at the very least, there's Satan knocking at our door, trying to get us off the path of the intentional, holy thing that we are going after. And so I'd like to suggest that we actually see God's people doing exactly this, and we see God's people doing that in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy is actually kind of so named. Deuteronomy comes from the Greek word deutero, which means second, and nomos, which means law, the second law. The name of the book itself indicates that we've done this all before. We've stated the law, God stated where he wanted his people to go, but things kind of fell off the tracks, and we sort of saw that in a big way through this whole series. In fact, we are now starting the fourth act of this series called The Never-Ending Story. And in the first act, you'll remember that we talked about how God established this paradise, but that through sin, there's this kind of cycle of sin and exile and redemption, but the sin kept on continuing. So what did God do in Act 2? He invaded. He allowed his presence to dwell and to be placed within the context of his own people, to narrow the gap between God's people and him. But what did we see in Act 3? We saw it all through Pastor Lloyd's sermon series through Numbers, that the God's people found themselves in the wilderness, ever wanting to get towards that final stage where they're this beautiful butterfly of an emerging, wonderful creation in God. And even though God had yet invaded, they were still very much in the wilderness and still very much getting off track and not quite falling along the way. But God is good, and God is gracious, even to that wayward people. And even through all this time, and there's so many stories to go through in Numbers, ones that weren't even spoken about, but God still nonetheless got this people to arrive at the doorstep of the promised land. And so here at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the very next book, it's the fifth book of the Bible, we find ourselves asking the question, how are we going to slowly caterpillar our way towards that reality of the beautiful butterfly? And so in this fourth act, we are now asking, we are calling the march of the caterpillar, slowly getting ourselves into some semblance of following after God. And so here we are in Deuteronomy. At the very beginning of this book, the setting is God's people are on the other side of the Jordan River on a mountain looking out over the promised land. Yes, we're here. We finally made it. But God says through Moses, no, wait. What we're going to do is we're going to take some time to remember. You have a goal. I, indeed, God, have a goal for you. And we're going to take a moment to pause and remember what is that is happening. And that is what I think is going on in a big way in Deuteronomy chapter 6, which is what Karen just beautifully read for us. Deuteronomy chapter 6 I have selected as the passage because though we are talking about Deuteronomy as a theme of this march of the caterpillar back out of the wilderness into some sort of semblance of the final destination, chapter 6 kind of offers for us a good overview of the themes of the entire book. So what I want us to do is I want to step into Deuteronomy chapter 6. And so if you do have your Bibles, it'll be well worth you to open up to chapter 6 because we're going to be going verse by verse through this to see what God might have for God's people. But indeed, here's what I want to give us the opportunity to do as well. Because we're not just simply looking through this story as a way to inform ourselves what God's people were doing thousands of years ago. Because I do believe that in this, there's a message for us as well as a people. Perhaps this is not just an opportunity for God's people to sit on the mountainside and pause and reflect and remember what God is doing with his people, but maybe this is an opportunity for us to remember what God is doing with us. Have you come to worship ready for that this morning? And I know, believe me, you have so many stresses in your life. There's so many things going on, so many obligations, so many cares. You might even have the children in your home just kind of yammering on in the other room, full of distractions. So I do understand if your heart is not in a place, but I do invite you, as you are able, consider this an opportunity to stand before God and say, God, help me remember. Remember where we have come as a congregation, where I have come as a person through these last very difficult wilderness months, and indeed what God might have been teaching us through these last several sermon series. We don't just simply come to worship just simply to have it be a one-off episodic thing. We are looking to grow, and I hope that we might reflect with God and remember what he is doing among us. So, let's go into chapter 6, shall we? Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 1. These are the commandments, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord God of your ancestors promised you. Admittedly, when we see this command from God to obey over and over and over again, we had that several times over the last number of series, obey, obey, obey. I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes that sort of repetition of obey kind of gets us to get our backs up, right? I don't know if that's just being human or in our culture. Pastor Lloyd even admitted this in a number of sermons ago, that we, even as Christians, have sometimes a hard time accepting God as the God that must be obeyed. And yet at the same time, as I was reflecting on this, why is it so hard for me to obey and for me to accept that obedience is a core part of this? I remember that there's so many different parts in my own life where obedience is actually not hard. I tend to obey the laws of the land. I obey social norms. I don't have a problem with obeying social norms. I don't have a problem with obeying the rules of a game that I might be playing. How many of you are in an intense game situation? Someone's breaking the rules and you're like, like it's not about, like you're not just trying to, maybe you're trying to be a little bit of a stickler, maybe. So you and me, the sticklers among us, why do we do this? Because that's how order and fun, and that's how you can actually enjoy the game. You see, it's not hard to follow the rules. It's not hard to obey when you know what's at stake. When there's a sort of internalized promise that comes with that obedience. And so notice what God is doing here in the first 3 verses of Deuteronomy. This is not a God, lest we understand God and his intentions, who is just simply saying, obey, obey, obey. Because we can so often receive these as just, if the person's just saying to us, obey, 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 we end up thinking, does this person even care about me? Do my ideas even matter? Or do they only accept me insofar as I obey them? But let's see what God has promised through this. In verse 2, so that you might live, so God, as long as you live by keeping the decrees and commands, so that you might enjoy long life. Another promise that it will go well with you, that you will increase greatly, and that you will find yourself in a land flowing with milk and honey. We have to remember at the very beginning very outset, that God has offered a promise with this obedience. This is in the context of a God who has established a relationship with his people and is bringing them to the promised land. Like think about it. Think about the scene. They're going in the promised land. They've been 40 years in the desert, and they see what is in store. Like, can you imagine if you were to see right in front of you this promised land of you waiting forever, and God was saying, all you have to do is obey the rules. I mean, if I were to be promised a very good board gaming session, and all I had to do was follow the rules just so that there was some order and not chaos, I would say, sign me up. Obedience comes with a promise. And so I ask us the question, do you know what God is asking you? Is there an area of disobedience in your life? This is our opportunity to reflect. And remember, we're not receiving obedience as just some demanding, one-sided thing, because God has shown his faithfulness to us. I invite you to consider, how has God shown his faithfulness to you, that he might have demonstrated himself worthy to be obeyed? He is the creator of the universe. Who else in this world would give us the proper way to live such that it would go well with us in our lives? But do you even know what God is asking of you? Have you spent the time to consider his statute? At the very beginning, in verse 1, these are the commands, decrees, the laws the Lord, the God directed me to teach you to observe. Have you allowed God to teach you his commandments? And as we continue on, we learn very quickly that obedience is just one half of the story. Because, as I've sort of hinted at, it's not just simply about obedience, but it's also about what chapter 6, verses 4 through 9 are speaking about as well. Chapter 6, verse 4, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Verse 5, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Pause there for a second. Where is this coming from? This command to love. It seems kind of a weird way to ask for love, right? I mean, on the surface, if we had no context, we were just hearing this, love me, love me, love me. Love doesn't come out of this sort of command, right? It comes out of a mutuality. But remember the context of where we have come. And remember, you're an Israelite sitting on the side of the mountain. What has God demonstrated to you already? Let's go back for a second to chapter 5, verse 6. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God started first. We tend to forget that God is the creator of the universe. He is the supreme being. He is God, King of kings. How does God even have any interest in lowly beings such as ourselves? The Israelites at the time would have understood that. All the religions of the time didn't necessarily consider God as this personal, loving God. These were beings to be feared because they didn't have any particular agenda for humanity. If they had any sort of desire at any moment to kind of do away with humanity, they would just be done away with. There was no care or concern. But here is a God who has demonstrated faithfulness to God, who has created a covenant with them, who has shown mercy and love and restoration, even when we are ants to him. What is he doing with us? And yet God is the one who acted first. And so in the context of this, God is asking his people to remember that he loved them first. In response to remembering that, he is asking them to love the Lord, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul and all your strength. This is convicting for me because this is one of those passages that we've heard so many times as Christians. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. It comes into as a refrain, but think about. I've had a lot of time to think about that, and so you only have maybe a few seconds here to think about it. But think about this. Can you say that of anything else in your life? That you love it with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength? What in your life are you putting all your strength into? And is that God? Do you love anything? Now, some of us might be feeling like, oh, well, maybe I might have been treating my family that way. Maybe I've been feeling my work that way. Maybe I treat this particular hobby or passion that way, that I put all my strength into this. And so how do we feel about this God who asks for us to put all of our strength into loving him? And this is something that we often think of as so abstract. Like, what does this actually mean, loving God with all of our strength? Well, he tells us in the very next passages. Verse 6, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. These are not just simply rules to follow and maybe skirt around if we feel like the cops aren't watching. These commandments are a way that God has shown that he loves us, and our obedience to them is how we show that we love him. We speak of love languages, right? Gifts, acts of service, words of affirmation. God's love language is the law, is his commandments. Because that's how we show that we love him, by doing what he asks. And so this boggles our mind because we usually think of rules and laws as things that need to be evaded. But again, think of it in terms of that promise that is associated with it. If we were to be fully confident that a promise of goodness and wholeness, of it going well with us, was involved in this, why would we not want to respond to God in this way? Why would we not respond to all the things God has done for us by just simply doing what he asks? Putting the commandments on our hearts and going forward in verse 7, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, write them on your door frames and on your houses and on your gates. The illustration here is that to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength is to be surrounded by God. By surrounded by him and his will, and being so connected with him that you are just surrounded and immersed in him. Can I say that about God? Because I confess that I don't know that if I can realistically say I am loving him with all of my strength, because all of my strength in this time is going towards other things. This has been very convicting for me. Because I can get myself involved in other things. And these are indeed things that God has put in our lives in order to serve him. Of course, he has asked us to serve him and do things for him. But notice that the order of things that are going him, he has first asked us to love him, to talk about him with our children, to put his words around us, to not just simply do and do and do, but to love him. Do I love God with all my strength? Now I caution you, because right now, as this comes as a command, this might be received as another thing to do. Well, you just gotta love him. You just gotta suck it up and love him. What I ask, and my invitation for you today is to ask 3 questions in this order. First question, why do you love Jesus? This is not like that accusatory, why do you love Jesus? It's genuinely asking, what brought you to come on board with this person on Jesus in the first place? What was the thing that enticed you into his arms? I'm sure it wasn't just some sort of desire for more rules in your life. There is something that brought you into the loving embrace of Jesus, some love, some community, some indication that there was promises for goodness and wholeness and fulfillment, acceptance and love. What was it for you? Why do you love Jesus? Focus on that, and not just sort of the what do I need to do about it. Focus on what is it that brought you to him in the first place. Second question, and can you say that you do love him with all your heart and soul and strength? That thing that you initially came to Jesus for, are you living into that with all of your strength? And then the third question, what barriers to that love exist? What has gotten you off the rails? And here I am admitting before you right now that I'm in the same boat as well. Don't take this as another thing to just kind of heap on more guilt onto yourself. God is here at this mountaintop as we are looking into the promised land, giving us an opportunity to remember. Not an opportunity to say, man, you screwed it up so many times. Is that what God is saying here? He does remind us of where he's coming, but again, the whole purpose of this Deuteronomy passage is for him to say, remember what I've done for you, and remember what this is all about. This is not just about the rules. This is about a love relationship. And so we go on. Chapter 6, verse 10. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large, flourishing cities that you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant, when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. God is not here scolding his people. Oh, you didn't build this stuff yourself. What he's saying is he's reminding them, I have given this all to you. And yet they are now going into as a people out of a time of wilderness into a time of abundance. And God is warning them before they even get to say, remember what this is all about. Remember me. Because once we get out of the wilderness and as we slowly as a caterpillar make our way out of this wilderness, there might be a tendency for you to forget me. And for how many of us is that our story? Have we forgotten God in our abundance? I have available to me so many things. Just like you. I mean, we're all in different levels of ability, but we have can we all admit that we have so many blessings around us? And yet have those blessings brought us closer to God, or has that just simply gotten us to replace God? God predicted this. He told the Israelites, this is what's going to happen. You're going to go, you're going to find this abundance, the thing that I gave you in the first place, and you're going to forget me. Again, it is so easy to receive this as shame, guilt, feel bad about yourself. No, remember. Remember Queensway. Remember what this is all about. Remember from where your abundance comes. And remember who you serve. Moving on to verses 13 to 15. Fear the Lord your God, serve him only, take your oaths in his name. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the people around you. For the Lord your God, who is among you, is a jealous God. And his anger will burn against you, and he will destroy you from the face of the land. Now we might say, oh, well, we don't follow other gods. That's fine. I follow the Christian God. I don't follow any other religions, but not so fast. You see, the reason why God was warning people against following other gods, because again, this would be another way for these people to forget him. By following other gods, they might be confused and thinking, well, if I come and I follow this God, if I adopt this practice, if I adopt this truth claim, if my worldview shifts to accept this thing that is in the land that I am receiving, then that's completely compatible with following God. Yeah, I will absolutely just kind of adopt that, and God will be fine with that. God gave us the land after all, and he would want me to fully mix in with the culture. And yet, How many of us have signed into the gods of our culture, even though they don't look on the surface like they're gods? The god of wealth, the god of success, the idol of sports, the idol of diversion, the god of achievement. I ask you, I ask us, what is occupying our headspace more than God? Because that's what God was really after. I want your headspace to be all about me. I want you to love me with all your soul and your strength. But their headspace and their rationality kind of gets occupied by this other thing. What goal are you pursuing over God? I can so easily just go to a smug place and say, no, I follow God, but I think about myself. And I too have been tempted by the god of wealth. I have been tempted by the god of diversion. I have been tempted by the god of my own abilities. And we can see here what God is actually, a deeper level of that what God is doing here. Because see, God is not just simply telling them some sort of future hypothetical things that will happen, but God here with his people on the edge of the wilderness is reminding them of things that they have already done. He is telling them the story of the wilderness and saying, these are the things that I was looking to do and to work within you in the wilderness. Back in Deuteronomy earlier in chapter 4, God makes reference to the story of the Baal of Peor. And actually this comes from Numbers number 25, verse 1 to 5. I'm just going to read this story for you just very briefly. And we didn't cover this story in our Numbers series, but just very briefly, 5 verses in Numbers 25. We'll see one thing that happened in the wilderness with God's people. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before the gods, so Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of these people, kill them, expose them in broad daylight before God, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's judges, "Each of you put to death those of your people who have yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor." It's an intense story, an intense warning. You see, God in the wilderness was trying to bring his people back, but the people were constantly falling away, falling aside. And what is God to do? What recourse did they have available to them? I know from our modern sensibilities it can seem very extreme, but God was trying to establish a covenant people, a holy people. And there was infections coming from all sides. He was in the wilderness. He was teaching his people. He was teaching how important it was that God be the number one thing that occupy our mind. And he's now at the edge of the wilderness, using this wilderness as an illustration. And we can see how this continues on in the very next section of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 16 to 19. "Do not put your Lord to the test as you did at Massah." Pause. Do we remember the story of Massah? Exodus chapter 17. We preached on this a while ago. Water from the rock. What happened? The Israelites quarreled and tested God by saying, we need water. We don't trust you, God. And all the way back, and the end of this story in Exodus chapter 17, verse 7, what does it say? He says, he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is God among us or not?" Again, we're uncovering the layers of what God has been doing all this time in the wilderness. He was testing his people. Do they actually trust me? When things get hard, Will I still be the number one thing on their mind? Will they still know that I love them and I will provide for them? Because we know from our own experience, right? When we feel like God has disappointed us or is far from us or distant from us, this is when we distance ourselves. See, God uses these difficult situations in order to show us that we need to continue to rely upon Him. And so I ask the question, where has your disappointment with God caused you to distance yourself from Him? Am I like the Israelites at Massa, waiting for God to provide and yet saying, you know what, I'm done waiting for God. I am not going to wait. Remember, we've already learned in Numbers that there are two different ways to complain. It is okay to complain to God. It is okay to say, God, this sucks. But we do it with trust in God and not denying His lordship over us. Go look back at Lloyd's sermon a couple sermons ago, where fully working out that. God has been working through His people in the wilderness. And then finally, we see in Deuteronomy 6:20-25. In the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God commanded you? Oh, very good question. What is the meaning of this? See what God is doing here? He's saying, what are you going to say about all this stuff? Because you could say that these laws and decrees and stipulations are all just this demeaning God who just wants simple obedience from us. But here's what God says to tell them. Those who ask, what is the whole meaning behind all of this? We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes, the Lord sent signs and wonders, great and terrible, on Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But He brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land He promised on oath to our ancestors. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all this law before our God, as He has commanded us, that will be our righteousness. Can you articulate what God has done for you? That's the final question. If someone were to ask you, what is the meaning of this God who tells you all these things to do, this God who doesn't seem to care about us, this God who has allowed this pandemic to come upon us, this Jesus, this bread, this wine, what does this all mean? Are you able to articulate verbally to your kids, to your friends, to your neighbors? Because this is good news. This was good news to the Israelites, and we have good news as well. We have good news that fulfills all of this good news, which is that we have a risen Lord, that Jesus Christ has come and died and given us the promise of life and abundance here today and for eternity. We have the best news in the world, that this pandemic is not the end, that even through this pandemic we have the promise of life, that even through this wilderness we have God living in our midst. God, in the Israelite times, He lived in the midst in the tents, but now God lives in our hearts. And we walk through this wilderness with God in our hearts, always close to us, that if we just simply turn to Him, like the Israelites are invited to just simply turn to Him, He's there. He's available, and He is powerful to overcome anything in front of us. Can you articulate that good news? If someone asks, have you been practicing that? Have you allowed yourself opportunities among the people that you meet, among the people in your household, but what the good news of God is for this world? These revelations don't come about in prosperity. And just 2 chapters later, in chapter 8, verses 1-5, God fully unveils the curtain of what He's been doing in this wilderness the entire time. That indeed the wilderness is the place where God has used to form His people. Chapter 8, verse 1. Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you, in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. On the one hand, we can say, well, this seems kind of harsh, God disciplining us. But see what God was doing. He was forming a people. He was sharpening them to understand and rely upon him, to show him that he was loving and trustworthy. We do this with our children, those of you who are parents. We need to discipline not because we don't like our children, but because we need to show them the way to live. The wilderness that the Israelites were, what God was here doing on the mountain, on the other side of the promised land, was telling his people that the wilderness was not just simply a blip. The wilderness was not punishment. The wilderness was the opportunity for them to be formed into the God-fearing people they were. The wilderness was not a mistake. The wilderness was where God was showing and demonstrating and increasing your love and faithfulness for him. And as we sit back and realize that, I think we can see truth in that. Because in nothing in life do we gain and do we grow in just the easy parts. It's through the struggle. It's through the adversity. It's through working out our faith in fear and trembling that we find ourselves even more passionate about God. And so as we look back on the message of Deuteronomy, to obey, to love, to accept the abundance, to have no other gods, to trust, and to proclaim the good news. Consider that it is through this very wilderness we find ourselves in that God is working all of this through. But don't let this opportunity to remember pass you by, because we will be out of this wilderness. And we will be into the land of abundance again. And we will celebrate. And we will enjoy being back together. We will enjoy having church again and seeing one another. But let's take this time on this mountaintop, Queensway, to remember. Remember what we have learned. Remember what God has shown us through the wilderness. Remember the testing. Remember the failures. But remember the successes. And let us at this time remember and re-covenant with God to obey and to love with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all of our strength. Amen.